This is Pod Populi, podcast for the people.
Welcome to the Real Estate Finder podcast. I'm Matthew Maschler, real estate broker here in the great state of Florida. And I love doing this podcast because I like sharing my information with you. And every once in a while, I get questions, and I think it's important that I answer them, not just to the agent or the customer that asked the question, but I think it's important to share those answers with you, my audience. So a question that we received the other day was about seller financing. It's and I'll just read it to you. A buyer called me asking about my listing. He is asking about seller financing. If he puts $50,000 down, who would make the terms up? A lawyer? So seller financing can be a little complicated. Let me break it down for you. First of all, not every seller can or even wants to offer seller financing. What seller financing means is that the seller, instead of receiving money when he sells the property, usually he gets money. The buyer's proceeds, the buyer brings cash or a mortgage to the closing. That is used to pay off the seller's mortgage, and after expenses and other fees, the seller receives a check or a wire for the remaining equity in his home. And in a seller financing, the buyer would make a deposit. And then the seller, instead of receiving money, would receive a note, a promissory note, and a payment plan. And the buyer would make their mortgage payments directly to the seller. The seller would basically be the bank. So not every seller would want to or can offer seller financing. If the seller owes a lot of money to their bank, right? If the seller has a large mortgage, that mortgage needs to be paid off at the closing. And if the buyer is not coming with money to the closing, the seller can pay off his mortgage and be the bank for the buyer. So in all of those cases, seller cannot offer seller financing. Maybe the seller has other uses for the money. They're buying another house. They're selling their house in one place, buying a house in the other, and they need the money from the sale to buy the other house. So, and then also maybe a seller just doesn't want to, right? Doesn't want to. It's not being a landlord, it's being a lender. If the buyer doesn't pay, then the seller, who is now the bank, has to foreclose against the buyer. And a lot of sellers don't want to put themselves in that position. They want to invest the money differently. But if the rate is attractive enough, maybe if the house can't sell for whatever reason, or they're getting a premium for the house, they were going to invest the money anyway, and the buyer's offering to pay them interest, then maybe the seller would consider seller financing. So if you get an offer, you get a buyer on your listing, or if there's an agent comes with a buyer on your listing and they ask if there's seller financing, you could ask the seller. It's actually a good idea to ask the seller in advance at the listing appointment, because you could actually check the box for seller financing. But most of the time, the seller can't or doesn't want to offer seller financing. So in this case, the buyer came in and said, would the seller do seller financing? And so what I told the agent to do is, first off, ask the seller. And the seller does not have a mortgage. They don't have a specific use for the money, a different investment that they want to use. And the seller would consider seller financing. So back to the question, who writes the terms? And in general, a good rule of thumb is, if they're business decisions, the seller and the buyer have to negotiate the terms. If they're legal decisions, when you say who writes the terms, like who writes the promissory note and the mortgage, well, a lawyer would do that for the bank. A lawyer would do that for the seller. But business decisions have to be like the price, the down payment, the length of payments, number of payments, whether it's interest only, the term of the loan, how long the loan is. Those have to be agreed to between the buyer and seller before they sign a contract. So who writes the terms? Business terms by the parties, the buyer and seller. Legal terms by the lawyer at the closing. And just like the bank will send a package with a mortgage and a note and other documents, that the seller steps into the shoes of the bank, plays the role of the bank for the buyer. The buyer will buy the property and use the seller's funds to buy it. So, so now you have a situation where the buyer asks, the seller says, yeah, okay, I would consider it. So the advice now I give to my agent is you write an offer. It's the exact same as any other deal. You write an offer. If the buyer came to you directly, you're representing both sides in Florida, that's great. You draft your offer, your Florida as is contract. When we were talking about this, sometimes they said, like, well, what happens if the buyer doesn't pay? Does the seller have to foreclose? Yes, the seller forecloses. The seller doesn't remain the owner of the property after the closing, right? That would be a rental. If the seller's if the owner rents to a person and the person makes rent payments, that would be a rental. But here you're having a closing, you're having a sale, just like any other sale, a buyer and a seller, and a closing date. So you draft the Florida as is contract. The biggest difference is in the financing section under section paragraph 8 of the contract is the financing section, and usually you would check paragraph 8 section A for a cash transaction or B for a financing transaction. You don't check either of those. You check D for seller financing. There is no mortgage contingency because the buyer has been approved for the mortgage. The seller is offering the buyer a mortgage, so the buyer can't later cancel the contract and say I can't get a mortgage because the seller is giving the mortgage. So that you don't need option B for seller financing, and it is not option A for a cash deal. You're using option D for seller financing, which references addendum C to the comprehensive rider. So you make in your forms, if you're here with us at Signature, you go to Total Brokerage, you pull up your forms, you do your as-is contract. The only change you make, 8D instead of 8A or B, and then you add the rider for seller financing. And the buyer and seller initial it. There's a bunch of disclosures. There's a lot of rules about lending. Lenders have to make sure that the buyers have certain credit requirements, but a seller selling their own property is exempt from that as long as they only are doing this like once in a while, one property a year. And on that, Rider C will have all of these rules because when the Dodd-Frank and all the consumer protections came in after the 2010 financial crisis, you still needed the ability for sellers to offer seller financing, and the seller can't be held to the same underwriting standards. But now on page 2 of seller financing, it's basically fill in the blank, and I'm going to go through it with you. And when you asked about the terms, who writes the terms, this is where the terms of the loan get written. That way they're part of the contract. So when you get to the closing, everything's agreed upon. So you do your as-is contract with your seller financing addendum. The seller, which says in section 2 on page 2, seller agrees to hold a note secured by a first or a second purchase money mortgage. If the buyer is getting a loan from a bank for the first mortgage and they're short, they can ask the seller for seller financing for a second mortgage. It can interfere with their creditworthiness. It may affect the first mortgage. In this scenario, we're talking about a first mortgage, so you check the box for first mortgage. And then in section A, it says fully amortized for a term of blank, if left blank, then 30 years. So basically, there's 4 choices here, and this is the payoff schedule. Fully amortized means that the principal and interest will, after the term of the loan will be paid off. So the typical mortgage, the typical 30-year fixed rate mortgage is fully amortized. There are 30 years of payments, 30 times 12. So each month, the borrower will pay principal and interest. And at the end of the loan is completely paid off. That means it's fully amortized. That's option A. And that's good if the seller is offering a 30-year mortgage. Most of the time with seller financing, they're not. They're shorter, 3 years, 5 years. And what happens is the buyer is expected to either have a better job or have better credit in those 3 or 5 years, and then they can refinance the loan at better terms with a bank. So option A is for a fully amortized mortgage. That's probably not the option that the seller is going to choose in this scenario. Option B is an interest-only mortgage, and requires monthly, quarterly, annually, or other periodic interest payments. Option C is a balloon mortgage, and what that does is it makes the schedule, an amortization schedule. Let's say you follow the 30-year amortization schedule for 5 years, right? There's 25 years left, so the loan's not paid off. A balloon mortgage means whatever's left at the end of the term has to be paid off, and that's usually by the buyer refinancing. And then option D is an adjustable rate mortgage. It's very complicated. I don't recommend it. What I recommend in this scenario is the interest-only mortgage. That'll be the most affordable for the buyer, the most simple, the easiest way to figure it out. So if, let's say, the property is $400,000 and the buyer's bringing $50,000 down, then there's a $350,000 interest-only mortgage. And if it's monthly payments, 10%, at 10%, you can negotiate the rate. If it's 10%, it's $35,000 a year. So it's a little bit less than $3,000 a month to pay interest only for a period of terms, if left blank, 60 months. So you could do 1 year, 3 years, 10 years interest only. But then at the end of the term, the entire principal balance has to be paid back. And there's no other options permitted. It can only be one of those 4: fully amortized, interest only, balloon, or adjustable rate. And then the next paragraph is filling out what those rates are, whether it's monthly or quarterly or annual payments, of how much they are, and how many months it is. And then, as long as the as-is contract and the seller financing addendum are all signed and executed, the buyer is under contract, and it's exactly like any other deal. The buyer is buying, the seller is selling. It's exactly like every other deal. You go through your inspections, you get title the same way every other deal is, and then at closing, the seller is going to need a lawyer to draft the documents, the mortgage and the note. You could and in every deal we describe who pays for those fees. It's in the title fees, and it's generally the borrower that is paying those expenses for those fees. So that is how you handle seller financing. Quite often, though it's not as, I don't want to say simple as this, it didn't seem simple. Quite often, the buyer will say, does the seller offer seller financing? And the seller will say no, because the seller doesn't want to, or the seller can't. But again, if the situation calls for seller financing, this is how you do it. It's just, you just have to remember, it's like any other deal with the buyer and seller, except that instead of the bank, the seller is the bank and takes that role. All right. If you have any other questions, please feel to reach out to me, Matt at Real Estate Finder, realestatefinder.com. Check out our newsletter, subscribe at realestatefinder.com. You'll see our featured listings. You can subscribe to the newsletter, links to all the podcasts, and a very handy preferred vendor list. We wouldn't be here without our network of preferred vendors, our roofers, our title agents, our mortgage brokers, our photographers. Shout out to Jamie Riley, our very favorite home inspector. And we just added a limo company to our vendor list. So shout out to Paul at Go Limo, and hope to thank you for joining us here at the Real Estate Finder podcast. I hope you found this helpful. If you have any other questions, please feel to reach out, and I look forward to answering them for you on the air.
And the storms pass by, the sky's dark blue and it's almost that time. Light shows, cameras flash when I pass. Living in the moment, forget about the past. They save the best for